Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our first of hopefully many bi-monthly Roybal lectures. This webinar is brought to you by the Roybal Center for Promoting Adherence to Behavior Change and Enhancing Cognitive Function, which is a collaboration between scientists at the University of Michigan and Penn State. And if you'd like to get announcements for future webinars, please sign up for our mailing list at roybal.umich.edu. I am the Roybal Center Manager. My name's Ann Maringer, and I'll be monitoring questions for today's session. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can enter them throughout the session, and we will leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the seminar to try to get to as many of those questions as we can. So today you will be hearing from Dr. David Conroy on Adherence to Behavior Change, Overview of Models and Mechanisms. Dr. Conroy is a professor at the University of Michigan School of Kinesiology and the Bickner Chair for Applied Exercise Science. He is also the director for the Roybal Center for Promoting Adherence to Behavior Change and Enhancing Cognitive Function. And I will let him take it away.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you everybody for tuning in today. I'm excited to get to share with you some of the ideas that have been keeping me up at night for the last few, days, weeks, months, years. And they revolve around the question of adherence to behavior change. And today, my goal is to present an overview of some of the models that are out there and some of the mechanisms that might be driving adherence. And the hope is that we can start to coalesce around some common terminology and common methods for talking about and measuring adherence. And I think, will be a key step in starting to move the science forward so that we can, develop interventions that will engage the mechanisms behind adherence. So as Anne mentioned, today's webinar is brought to us through the Roybal Center, which is supported by the National Institute on Aging. As far as my disclosures go, I receive funding for other projects that are looking at adherence-related questions from the NIDDK and NHLBI. I won't be presenting those results today, but I wanted to note those. And I also receive a contract from Therabody to conduct research looking also at behavioral interventions and adherence, but it won't be discussed today. What I will discuss today are three main points. I hope to persuade you of these by the end of our time together. And the first is that solving adherence as a problem is critical for improving public health. As much as we do with trying to initiate behavior change, it's really going to have limited impact until we solve this vexing problem of getting people to stick with that change. Second, I want to propose and reiterate previous proposals that adherence is not a state by itself. Adherence is instead a process. And by conceptualizing adherence as a process, it will force us to think of different ways of measuring it and trying to explain it. And finally, I'll leave with the idea today that adherence can be both behavioral and or motivational. And depending on how you're thinking of adherence, you would measure it quite differently. And that's important for moving the science forward. So let's get started. It's no secret that the United States is an aging nation. This is very salient for me today as I turn the clock on another year. By the year 2034, the federal government's projecting that we will have more older adults in the United States than children for the first time in history. And that's going to be remarkable because the majority of healthcare spending comes from older adults. So it's going to present a huge economic burden for the country. And we have an opportunity, if we can figure out how to promote healthy aging, to help ease the burden on older adults and on those who take care of them and on the systems that try to take care of them. So we need to deal more with aging in this country. One of the issues that's going to be especially prominent as we have this graying population is the incidence of dementia is also expected to increase dramatically. The best estimates I've seen recently are that we'll see dementias double by the year 2060. That sounds like it's far off in the future, but as I count down the years ahead, It's really not that far. This is going to happen for both men and women, and we're currently unprepared with no validated treatments or prevention strategies for Alzheimer's disease or dementias. Now, I say no validated strategies. We do have promising approaches, and physical activity is one of the most promising strategies that we have for reducing risk for dementias. The evidence behind this conclusion has been reviewed by a number of groups. The Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee had a brain health subcommittee. I consulted for them leading up to the 2018 Physical Activity Guidelines, and they concluded that physical activity is going to reduce Alzheimer's risk. And we'll take a look at their conclusions more detailed in a moment. But the national academies, in their consensus report, Preventing Cognitive Decline in Dementia, they identified physical activity as one of the three most promising strategies for reducing dementia risk. And the Lancet Commission on Dementia recently published a new report identifying that you could reduce half of dementias or prevent half of the dementia cases from occurring if we could just eliminate 14 risk factors, among which physical activity was one. So we have great evidence that ties physical activity and regular physical activity with reduced risk for dementia. What we don't have is the definitive clinical trial stretching back to establish this relation. So what does some of that evidence look like? The Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee found that regular physical activity was associated with improved cognitive functions. This came from both observational, prospective, as well as intervention studies where supervised exercise programs were delivered with controlled doses and cognitive function improved among those engaged in supervised exercise. There was moderate evidence that regular physical activity could reduce cognitive decline by as much as 38%, with follow-ups varying from 1 year to a little over a decade. And there was strong evidence from observational and prospective studies that regular physical activity reduced the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease by 40%. Now, we say strong evidence and moderate evidence here, not as a reflection of the size of the effects, but rather the consistency of the evidence and the experts' confidence that the conclusion was in the right direction and representative of the broader population. So these are not statements about the effect size, the strong and moderate. They're more about the conclusions about the rigor of the evidence. Now, this is great that physical activity can reduce dementia risk, but as a population, we are not engaging in sufficient physical activity in the United States. About 3 out of 4 American adults are not meeting the National Physical Activity Guidelines. And as you see in these data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, about 3/4 of this problem of insufficient activity increases as people get older. So you see young adults shown in green, midlife in the blue-gray, leading into the light green, and then older adults in the gray bars here. So older adults are especially vulnerable to not getting enough activity, but there's no point in the adult lifespan where we can let our guard down and say people are getting enough activity. And this is a challenge because most of the evidence linking physical activity with brain health and dementia risk comes from older adults. But in prevention, you really don't want to start at the point of disease incidence. You need to start much earlier in time so that the physiologic adaptations and biologic adaptations have time to occur and reduce risk. So promoting physical activity in older adults is an important end in and of itself for many reasons: improved function, improved quality of life, but it's not going to be sufficient for addressing this problem of reducing dementia risk. For that, we need to start earlier in life, and midlife might be the next logical starting point for getting people to increase their activity and then trying to help them sustain that for a long period of time. Now, there are, when you pull back and think about it, 3 phases of lifestyle behavior change that each requires a different definition of what a person is doing to engage in a behavior. And as a intervention scientists, I think there's people who are pre-intervention. They've never had anybody systematically do anything for them or with them to help them increase their behavior or modify their physical activity. They're pre-intervention. They've been living in the natural context of their daily life without having that active support for boosting activity. Then perhaps one day they decide they want to enroll in a trial, or their community decides to start new programs and they decide they want to take part. They enter an intervention phase where they're actively trying to increase physical activity levels. And at some point, those intervention phases end, whether it's 3 months later or a year later. But typically, funds will run out, or the novelty and interest will run out on the participants' part. But at that point, active intervention supports cease, and the person is on their own again, and they're living their post-intervention life, which might be very similar to their pre-intervention life in that they're not getting the supports. And unfortunately, many in the field will tell you people's activity levels return back to pre-intervention levels over time. Now, the consistency and level of behavior that people engage in for physical activity gets described in many ways. Sometimes you hear people writing or presenting, talking about maintenance of behavior. Sometimes they talk about adherence, which is a term I prefer. Sometimes you'll hear them talk about compliance. It's a little more common in maybe the supervised exercise trials where the stimulus is being tightly controlled and you just need people to comply with coming into the exercise sessions. Sometimes sustainment. Bess Marcus, about a quarter century ago, remarked that there is not a criterion for successful maintenance that has been officially established, whether it's maintenance in the context of pre-intervention everyday life, or whether it's maintenance following an intervention period. There is not a clear consensus. And there have been some really interesting papers in the 25 years or so since that comment was made. And I want to try to highlight some of them today as we look at the scope of definitions and build out this concept of maintenance or adherence in behavior change. One paper that was really informative in this area, and I'd recommend to viewers who are interested in the topic, was by Ryan Rhodes, looking at definitions that are used for maintenance and different theories that are described. And one of the salient points made in this paper was that maintenance involves behavior performed over time, but basing maintenance on a strictly temporal criteria, for example, 6 months, which is a definition that's come out pretty consistently over the years, has been duly criticized for being arbitrary. Indeed, there's nothing magical about 6 months. I remember as a student being given the dogma that after 6 months, half of the people who start a supervised exercise program will drop out. And this is the heart of the maintenance problem. And, why 6 months? Why not 2 months? Why not 4 months? Why not 1 year? The fact is, it could be any of those. And there's not a specific point in time at which we have to say that somebody is now maintaining their activity or failing in maintenance. Indeed, most theories that you look at about and build behavioral interventions out of are silent on what constitutes maintenance. They largely focus on how do you initiate behavior change, but not how you describe if somebody is maintaining that change. And outside of an intervention context, in that pre-intervention life people live, it's actually quite difficult because you don't have a starting point to use as a point of reference for whether a person's maintaining a behavior. Now, Genevieve Dutton and colleagues recently published a paper. It might still be in press, actually. It just came out last month or a month and a half ago. And they proposed and explored the possibility of using features of physical activity time series to try to operationalize maintenance. And they honed in on three key components in a time series or features of that time series. One is the threshold for saying a person is active. So what level of activity would you require someone to engage in to say they're being active? You can do this at the daily level. You could even do it at a faster time scale, like the hour, the minute. Um, this is very similar to the concept of cut points that are often used to label 60-second epochs or 10-second epochs of physical activity in accelerometer studies. But the level of activity required is the key behind a threshold. Durations are a second feature of these time series, and that's how long should a person be above a threshold to say that they're maintaining that behavior? Is 1 day above threshold enough? Should it be 6 months above threshold, as is kind of the implicit definition in a lot of writing in the field? You know, we don't specify duration very often, and this could be something that varies from study to study and likely impacts how many people are classified as maintaining their activity. And that's certainly what this group's data showed. The third concept is that of an allowance. The allowance is how much time is a person allowed to be below a threshold before they're considered to be not maintaining activity anymore. So if you miss 1 day of above threshold activity during the week, are you still maintaining your physical activity routine? It's important to build in some allowances for people to be below threshold because an important part of physical activity is recovery. It's taxing, and if you don't recover, you're running injury risk as well as risks of just not enjoying it because you're sore. So these three dimensions of the time series could be used to create a variety of definitions of maintenance. And I think this is a step forward for the field because it'll allow us to be a lot more specific about the process of data, of physical activity data that unfolds over time to be described as maintaining behavior change or not. Now, this is really useful, especially in contexts where there's no starting point for a baseline. So that pre-intervention context. It can be applied to intervention contexts, but intervention contexts actually open up a lot of different possibilities for how you might describe maintenance. And interventions, before you can study the adherence to behavior change or maintenance after the intervention, you have to think about how effective are interventions? What is happening as far as gains from an intervention in the first place? And here I draw your attention to a study by Wright et al. It was a benchmarking analysis of physical activity interventions where they pulled data from over 100 meta-analyses summarizing over 2,700 trials that recruited over 600,000 people. This is the most comprehensive data set on intervention effect sizes that I'm familiar with. And they broke out the results, for the general population, all interventions in the paper, but the supplemental files where the magic is because they break it out by subpopulations. And you can get estimates of what's the, median effect size for adults or for older adults. So for adults, they had 2,400 trials that they were able to draw on to get these effect sizes with almost 500,000 people. For older adults, they had 160 trials with just over 73,000 people. So pretty massive data sets in both cases. The findings were not too dissimilar. The 50th percentile was the median intervention effect across those studies. And it hovered between 0.2 and 0.25, kind of the low 0.2s, so not quite a quarter standard deviation change. And you can see the range. It's a little more variable for the adults than it is for older adults. In parentheses, next to those effect size estimates at the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentiles of each distribution, you'll see the effect size translated from standardized mean units into step counts. The step counts are predicated on average daily steps in Americans from some of Katrine Tudor-Lock's studies. But we're looking at, on average, being able to increase adults' physical activity by a little over 1,300 steps per day and older adults' activity by almost 400 steps a day. Now, the processes that are going into making those changes are fairly well defined. We have a whole set of self-regulation focused strategies, helping people set goals, helping them monitor their behavior. creating supportive environments for them. We can go on and list many mechanisms of action for initiating behavior change. Here, in a great paper by Alex Rothman and colleagues, they broke out this 2 by 2 grid of some of the mechanisms that might be responsible for initiating behavior change that might be more reflective in nature or automatic in nature, and some of the mechanisms of action that might be responsible for maintaining behavior change that are both reflective, like a person's satisfaction with how far they've come during the intervention period, or more automatic, such as habits they're developing where the behavior starts to be initiated without effortful control. So this is an important paper, I think, because it introduces the idea that it's not just about behavior, the level of a behavior being consistent or inconsistent. It's also possibly about the mechanisms that are behind the behavior shifting as you progress towards more maintenance. It's different mechanisms are involved in initiating behavior change than those involved in adhering to or maintaining that behavior change. And this, I think, gives rise to this or feeds into this process view that I mentioned earlier is on my mind a lot. So in the process view of behavior change, I propose we need to think of intervention periods as having a baseline where we can get a measure of where people are starting with respect to their behavior. And then we, deliver an intervention for them, whatever supports are involved in that, at whatever levels we're delivering those. And then sometime after the intervention supports are withdrawn, when the intervention period's over, we follow up with people at periodic intervals to measure their behavior again. And when you think about this kind of process-based measurement strategy, you can differentiate a few different components in the variance in behavior. The first is the obvious one, intervention gain. This is the change in behavior, change in physical activity from baseline to the end of the period where an intervention is actively being delivered and the person's behavior is being supported by an interventionist. So this is the standard measure that we take in studies of efficacy and effectiveness. Get your baseline measure, get your end of intervention measure, and draw your conclusion after the analysis of about whether the intervention caused more change for those who received it than they would have likely received if they or experienced if they hadn't received it. When you start looking to the right of that dotted line, the period that we described earlier as post-intervention, you could also think about this concept of post-intervention decay. And McEwen et al. Had a fantastic review about 4 or 5 years ago, well, 3 years ago, I'm sorry, in behavioral medicine, where they looked at the concept that some studies are characterizing the behavior change difference from the end of an intervention period to some time specified follow-up. So changes from the end of active intervention support to a time specified follow-up, say 1 month later or 6 months later, we can call that post-intervention decay. So presumably you'll have the highest level of a behavior at the end of the intervention period, not necessarily, but let's just assume that for simplicity now. And it's likely to wear off and some of that behavior change will disappear over time. So this is this concept of post-intervention decay. The third concept that the process view invites us to think about is that of residual gain. This is the change in a person's behavior from a baseline level to that time specified follow-up. So here you see post-intervention residual gain tells us about at some point long after the intervention supports have been withdrawn, is the person still engaging in more physical activity than they had prior to the end of or prior to engaging with the intervention at all? Now, it's important that those two words, time specified, there's not going to be a measure of post-intervention decay in the literature that would be a consensus for all. We really probably should put a subscript of T at the end of that. So it's post-intervention decay at 2 months, at 3 months, at 6 months, at 9 months, so that we can understand how long a time span has passed since the person received active intervention support. And the same thing with residual gain. We draw quite different inferences if this was residual gain that was 2 months after the baseline, where maybe they only had 1 month of intervention and then a 1 month follow-up. That would be quite different from if it was an 18-month post-intervention residual gain. And in McEwen et al.'s review, although they didn't use those terms specifically, they did find 31 studies that were in a systematic review they'd done previously looking at the role of theory on intervention effects. And those 31 studies were a part of a larger set, but these 31 had a post-intervention follow-up date. So they were able to separate out baseline to end of intervention to measure intervention gain, end of intervention to follow-up to measure post-intervention decay, and baseline to post-intervention follow-up to measure that post-intervention residual gain. And because these studies were done in different labs, they had different designs, different timescales. So I'm going to give you some quantitative summaries here. One thing to keep in mind is that you should take them with a bit of a grain of salt because the follow-up intervals, the intervention lengths, the intervention doses, the intervention effects were not all standardized. So these are really just to illustrate the idea that you can quantify these three parameters around to understand intervention adherence, or sorry, behavior change adherence better. So in the 31 studies that had the baseline to end of intervention assessment, they were able to quantify intervention gain. They found a significant increase, almost a half standard deviation. And that's about twice what we saw in the benchmarking study. So, again, put a little asterisk by that. These studies ranged in duration from 2 to 26 weeks of exposure to the intervention. So again, a lot of variability, not a lot of really long interventions. It gets out to 6 months, but nothing beyond there. The next estimate they came up with was for post-intervention residual gain. These studies had follow-ups that extended between 6 and 48 weeks beyond the baseline measurement. And here the intervention, the residual gain estimate was a standardized mean difference of about a third of a standard deviation, but this wasn't changing over time. Doesn't matter what the follow-up interval was. Whereas with the intervention gain, the longer the intervention period went on, the larger the effects were. And finally, the post-intervention decay estimates. The studies that they found that quantified post-intervention decay had 2 to 26 week long follow-ups from the end of intervention period to the follow-up assessment. The standardized mean change was quite low, which was really encouraging, but it got smaller as time got longer. So what we see here are three possible process variables that could be used as outcomes in clinical trials moving forward. If we want to advance the science of our understanding of adherence, it would be really helpful for us to move beyond just measuring intervention gain, but to put in these process measures and get follow-ups to capture decay at different time points and residual gain at different time points. Now, this tells us the magnitude of different adherence parameters, but it doesn't tell us why people were adhering. There has been a bit of work on this. McEwen et al. Looked at some of the behavior change techniques that were involved in the interventions that the 31 studies used. And they found that for intervention decay, and remember, decay is from the end of the active intervention support to the follow-up period. Interventions that involved a comparison of outcomes, for example, with goal setting or self-monitoring techniques, interventions that had techniques targeting self-beliefs, that created associations around activity, that targeted the antecedents of activity, or that targeted identity itself. These were all associated with reduced decay of interventions. So you saw more robust intervention effects beyond the end of intervention support when the interventions had used those techniques. Little asterisk here is that some of those techniques had not been used in too many studies. You have some that are based on 3 or 4 studies. So there's a lot still to learn here. With respect to residual gain at different time points following baseline, the effect was that interventions that had behavior change techniques had greater residual gain than those without the behavior change techniques. So there wasn't a lot of specificity in terms of which techniques are driving residual gains, but there was some specificity in terms of which techniques were contributing to reduced decay. Stephen Amaro and colleagues had published a review some years before that where they looked at the different factors that were influencing the post-intervention decay. I believe that was the way they had measured it. I'm sorry, residual gain. They were looking at baseline measures. And they found that capabilities and motivation seemed to be driving physical activity maintenance at the follow-ups after the end of active intervention support. There's about 20% of the variability on average that was accounted for. So there's still a lot of room to dig in on this problem and identify the mechanisms of action that support decay as well as residual gain. Domenica Kwasnica and colleagues have a review where they went through over 100 behavioral theories. I think the final set was 100, but they looked at more than that initially. And they extracted themes about what those theories were saying about factors that influence behavioral maintenance. And they identified 5 motives, self-regulation, resources, habits, and environmental and social influences. Um, some have said, these aren't all actually explaining maintenance since then. I think this is a very comprehensive mapping of candidate mechanisms that could be explored to understand decay and residual gain, though. So I want to highlight this paper as well to create a roadmap for those of you who are interested in joining us and figuring out this adherence problem. One of the things that our team has started to focus on is that interventions need to engage mechanisms of action on both fast and slow time scales. So we use text messages to deliver interventions. The idea isn't that people get a text message and all of a sudden go running out of whatever they're doing and start moving, but that it plants the seed of motivation, maybe creates an urge for activity, maybe it helps them remind them of a goal they already had to be active that had gotten crowded out by some of the other nonsense in their day. But these text messages are intended to produce increased activity in the hours that follow message delivery. So we consider this a fast time scale where you're hitting people with repeated messages multiple times a day. And the idea is that by delivering those messages, you're able to prompt an acute and direct response to the message. So there's nothing magical happening under the hood. It's you get this message, it reminds you, or it creates an urge. And over the next few hours, that message has its effect and you move a little more or not if it was the wrong message to send. But we think that over time, there's also a slower time scale that we want to help people change to develop and engage some of the mechanisms of adherence. And on that slower time scale, what we're really trying to do is to stimulate a more cumulative or indirect response that would help people rewire themselves effectively to change different mechanisms of action, not the mechanisms that initiate behavior change. Those are operating on that fast time scale, but instead change some of the slower time scale mechanisms, maybe like identity formation, where it's not going to happen from one single message or one meeting with a coach, but it rather is something that you progress toward over time. So we have fast time scale changes. We use the example of texting here, but it could be anything like sessions with a behavioral coach, prompts to self-monitor, you name it, something that happens often though. And those techniques are typically oriented around promoting or helping to improve self-regulation of behavior in the moment. They tend to be more effortful. They tend to engage reflective processes where people are aware that they should be moving more or would want to move more if they were to fulfill their goal. The slow time scale processes are likely not just based on self-regulation. They're probably, to my best estimate, based on associative learning processes instead. So a person's starting to learn about the activity, the context, the behavior themselves in a way that takes time and repeated experience in a very patterned way. So we think that combining these fast timescale targets and slow timescale targets might be a fruitful strategy for promoting adherence. So to be a little more specific about how we're trying to stimulate this cross timescale engagement of both to initiate behavior change and to support adherence, we use those text messages in a patterned way. So we've developed, in collaboration with Constantino Lagoa, an engineering colleague, some algorithms, and really it's a principled approach to developing person-specific algorithms. So we learn what messages people respond to under what conditions. And as the system learns this about the individual and it refines the coefficients in the models, it tunes them to be more and more specific for that person. And it uses those models then for the individual to make decisions about whether or not to send messages, and if sending a message, which type of message to send. Now, those are the fast time scale changes. The models are based on people's behavioral responses in the minutes and hours that follow message delivery. What we're thinking happens, though, is because the models are also identifying regular patterns in people's behavior, we're going to be able to stimulate some of those associative learning processes that are behind the slow timescale changes as well. Those slow timescale changes could involve creating associations between physical activity and different affective responses. So getting people to move more and feeling more pleasant because we're just promoting movement, not necessarily vigorous intensity activity. We just want people to get up and move a little more. And that can feel good in a variety of ways. So repeating that over time should create an association that physical activity feels good. Um, the equations, the models will also identify patterns in behavior across different contexts. Those contexts could be defined by the day of week. They could be defined by the time of day. They could be defined by the weather conditions outside. They could be defined by a person's recent activity. But once we understand the contexts that are associated with people responding successfully to the messages, we can start to lean in and exploit those insights to deliver messages in those moments when people are going to be most responsive to messages. And in doing so, we start to create associations between different contexts and increased physical activity. Over time, just the presence of that context should be enough to stimulate a person and activate the scripts for physical activity. And we often talk about this as habit formation, but this is the idea that the behavior should over time be experienced as being more automatic, and they don't need to think about being active as much anymore. They just find themselves fitting this into their routines. The last mechanism that we're targeting is identity. We believe that, and the literature shows that repetition is an important part of identity formation. People who do things more frequently will start to see the activity as something that is similar to them. And if we can get these fast time scale responses to be very tuned so they're highly efficient and we're not sending messages that don't have an effect, then people can start to have accelerated physical activity trajectories and over time start to see themselves as a more active person, regardless of the context they're in. Now, there's some great papers on automatic affective evaluations, on experienced automaticity, and on identity processes related to particularly bridging the intention behavior gap. And I would point you to those if those are the mechanisms you're interested in exploring. But I don't think that these are the only mechanisms that are involved in engaging or supporting people to have less decay and more residual gain from activity. So, you can go back to those previous papers and find other mechanisms that are worth pursuing. These are just the ones that we've prioritized. But beyond changes to the person and how they rewire themselves during the fast time scale intervention period, I think there are also some time varying factors that we need to start building into these studies of adherence. One is the time of year. Seasonality is something that we see in physical activity behavior. It's pretty consistent that the longer the days, the more hospitable the weather, the more active people tend to be. The shorter the days, the less hospitable the weather, the less active they tend to be. So we can start to map out the time of year over intervention periods. Now, what's interesting is if you have a 12-month study where there's a 6-month intervention period and a 6-month follow-up, the timing of when you enroll somebody and get their baseline assessment and when you get that follow-up assessment um, can lead to some confounded interpretations of behavior change. If you enroll somebody and get baseline in January and do a follow-up in June, just by the change in seasons alone, you might see an increase in activity. So we need to start being more thoughtful about how we bring seasonality and time of year into these models to separate that out from the adherence phenomenon itself. Subjective stress that could disrupt some of those learning processes and shift the balance from the automatic regulatory processes to some of the more reflective ones. It could also change the goals that people are pursuing at any moment in time. So we need to think a little bit about how the demands in a person's life, which are changing on a pretty constant basis, but how those are affecting the physical activity behavior data that we're seeing. Contextual stability. There was a fantastic paper just came out in Nature recently showing that when people move to more walkable communities, their activity increases. When they move to less walkable communities, their activity seems to decrease. So changing contexts, having predictable contexts, having built environments that are supportive and facilitate activity, all also play a role in these adherence dynamics. So as we rethink adherence, I think we can do a couple of things to move this literature forward. One is think a little bit more about the distinction between behavioral adherence and motivational adherence. When I say behavioral adherence, I'm talking about changes in the level of a behavior relative either to baseline, which would be the residual gain construct, or the end of intervention, which is the intervention decay construct. We can also start thinking, instead of just about mean differences, about the rate of change of behavior over time and how long is behavior stable before it starts to change. That could be another interesting parameter for understanding adherence. On the motivational side, we can think about changes in the control regimes that are regulating behavior. So one of the ideas that's out there is that as people progress from initiation to maintenance in the 2x2 model by Rothman and colleagues, they make a shift from more effortful control to hopefully more efficient regulatory processes. It may be that we see stronger associations between some of those automatic mechanisms and behavior that would indicate that a person is setting up for motivational adherence. So to wrap up, I want to remind us all that adherence has been a vexing problem in our field, but we have made progress. This is a paper from 43 years ago from Rod Dishman titled Compliance and Adherence in Health-Related Exercise. We haven't solved this problem. It's going to be the defining problem for the rest of my career, I'm fairly certain. But we've made progress. We know that we need to measure adherence now, and we have structures for measuring it that are coming out of some of these reviews, and we've tried to give some language to that today. We've seen some studies that are focused on adherence as the outcome of interest. So not just looking at immediate intervention effects, but what's left over time after a person's had the intervention supports withdrawn. We've seen progress in identifying some of the techniques that help to reduce decay or promote residual gain. We've seen work developing concepts about what the mechanisms of action are. So we're heading there, but we have a lot of work left ahead of us. And in the interest of winding down, I'll just remind you that this adherence problem, I think, is going to be the defining challenge for this generation of experts in motivation and physical activity behavior. It's going to be the key to improving public health, and it's going to be the key to setting the stage for that definitive trial showing that physical activity in midlife can reduce and be sustained and reduce risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease in later life. I think one of the keys to making that progress will be to think of adherence more as a process than as a state, which it has been largely viewed as previously, and also to differentiate between behavioral and motivational adherence as we move forward. So I invite you all to join us in working on these problems. We don't have the answers yet. We welcome dialogue and questions, and maybe we'll start that now. So thank you for your attention. And Anne, if there's some questions in the chat that you want to raise, I'd be happy to talk about those.
Yep, there is a question in the question box here. So, adherence to behavior change after an intervention may take a lot of time and intensive designs to meaningfully evaluate these processes as they require both intervention and post-intervention measurement periods. What practical challenges does this pose for researchers in this field? And do you have any advice on how to overcome these challenges?
The fantastic question. And I think that it's going to take a bit of a shift in terms of how we design studies and how we propose our studies. Doing studies that involve long-term follow-up are more expensive than doing studies that just track intervention effects. It's hard to justify the long-term focus in many grants, particularly with new interventions where reviewers may be skeptical or not persuaded that interventions are um, effective or efficacious yet. So what the strategy that we've been using to try to work this into our projects is to lay out the primary aims around intervention gain, but building in assessments after the end of active intervention support on the grounds that that's really the clinically meaningful question for us. It's great to increase someone's activity, but most interventions aren't sustainable. So we need to develop interventions that don't need to be sustained forever. And I think that that's nice as a secondary outcome in studies that you don't have to, that allows you to justify budget for them.
We have another question. There is more research in maintenance to other health behaviors like smoking. Can we learn anything from this research, or are health behaviors like physical activity and smoking too different?
It's a fantastic question. I think they are different behaviors. One's an addictive behavior that has, withdrawal dynamics to factor in. The other is presumably an appetitive behavior where people can enjoy the behavior and be drawn to it. One of the, I think we should be trying to draw from uh, insights on as many health behaviors as possible. Smoking's got this really interesting work on lapses and relapses during quit attempts. And this maps on very nicely to some of those maintenance features that Genevieve Dunton's mapped out with allowance and duration. So how long do you have to be adherent or maintain to be described as maintaining? And what happens if you have a day off? It'd be like, what happened if you had a puff on a cigarette? Does that count as a lapse or not? And looking at the timing of some of those allowances and how they're distributed over time might be quite informative. I don't know that we have the answer in either domain, frankly. I think the smoking cessation domain is still quite challenging, although we've had great success in reducing the number of smokers. Quitting is still a really hard problem, and getting people to adhere to it following a quit attempt. So yeah, I think we should cross-pollinate these literatures, but we shouldn't assume that one will necessarily generalize to the other because there are different dynamics behind those behaviors.
Well, thank you. There are currently no more questions typed in. I know you did want to end up. Oh, wait, I take that back. We have a question. Do you have time to answer one more? I know you wanted to end a
Yeah,
little bit early. Okay, so do you have any recommendations on when we should be operationalizing adherence to behavior change as post-intervention decay versus post-intervention residual gain in our research? What sort of research questions would both estimates be best suited to answer?
I think right now we know relatively little about decay or gain as separable processes. So I think there's value in measuring both. And we saw from the McEwen review that the behavior change techniques related to each may not be the same. They weren't the same in that study. So I think it would be very useful for us to measure both. It's just it's a matter of the statistical analysis to do that. As long as you get the follow-up, you can quantify both. And I wouldn't expect that what predicts one predicts the other. They're different starting points, and we have a lot to learn about them. So right now, I wouldn't say either one's a better candidate to go all in on, but I'd say get as much as you can from both. All right. Well, thank you, Anne, for moderating today. Thank you, everyone, for those questions. They were very thought-provoking, and I'm going to jot down some notes now myself. I hope you all will join us for our next seminar, which will be in about 2 months, and we'll be announcing it in the Roybal newsletter, which you can subscribe to at roybal.umich.edu. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.